So, hello everyone. Firstly, Happy New Year. I hope you all had a really nice holiday. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our second installment in the BSBI Winter Talk series. So today we've got Brett Wilson from the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of Cambridge. So Brett's just handed in his thesis and done his viva for his PhD in plant sciences. And he's done this on tulips in Central Asia. So yeah, it's really great to have Brett here. Just before we start, I should just mention that if you'd like to ask a question, we'll have a question and answer session at the end. You can type this into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the talk, I'll read out the questions to Brett. So feel free to post a question at any time during the talk. So yeah, without further ado, Brett.
Thank you very much, George. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Today, I'm going to present sort of the last 4 years of work that I've been doing, and this is through a PhD as well as a broader collaboration with a number of partners in Central Asia. And today, I'm sort of going to be trying to show you that taxonomy really underpins conservation with the sort of case that I've been working on, which is wild tulips. So tulips, I think we all know what a tulip is. They're a very common sight in spring gardens, and they're grown all over the world now. The Netherlands is often known as the home of tulips, and it certainly exports and produces the vast majority of these flowers. But we find festivals and these tulips growing in the Southern Hemisphere and across in North America as well. But the Netherlands really was the last stop in an epic journey for this flower. And the cultivation of tulips actually really began in the Ottoman Empire in the 12th to 14th century. And they were breeding new varieties that had these pointed tepals that you can see here in this picture. And it was really from the Ottoman Empire that tulips moved into Europe. And the first tulips really only arrived in Europe in the 16th century. And the first drawing of a tulip you can see here, which was done by Gesner in Augsburg in 1559, and it's the first sort of picture we have of a tulip within Europe. Now, the first real collection of tulips was established in Leiden in 1593 by a man called Carolus Clusius, who is very well known for his establishment of tulips and their popularity within Europe. And he became the director of the Botanic Garden in Leiden and established sort of the largest collection of tulips known in Europe at the time. And the popularity of this flower then grew massively across Western Europe, but especially in the Netherlands. And this led to one of the first financial bubbles ever to occur, known as tulip mania. And this occurred around 1636 to 37. And was very much driven by broken tulips that you can see here in these pictures with these incredible flower patterns. And at the time, it was not known what caused this, but of course, we now know this was caused by a virus. And so these are not as common anymore, and they're not well grown in many places. And the bubble crashed in 1637, but the cultivation of tulips has sort of continued on, if not at the same level, but certainly at a very high level for a garden plant. And we now have over 10,000 cultivars registered in the world, and there continue to be new ones bred every year. But where does the story really begin? We have the cultivation story beginning really in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. But we actually have to take another step back and think about, well, where would these original tulips have come from as well? And this is sort of the region I've been working in. And these are a lot of different wild tulip species that I've seen across Central Asia, shown to you here on this slide. And Central Asia is known as the most diverse region for wild tulips in the world. It has the most species of this type of flower in the world. and is likely one place that has played a very significant role in the cultivation of tulips, with some of these species being used to breed some of the ancestral cultivars, alongside a range of different species from Turkey and Iran. So I very much work on wild tulips, and so I'm now going to sort of pivot and talk about these ancestral flowers to the cultivated ones. And I just want to introduce this group to you and talk about the group as a whole. So where do wild tulips grow? Well, surprisingly, they're actually non-native really to Western Europe. So this pale yellow area of the map is actually where tulips have naturalized. So these are populations in the wild that have established from flowers that have escaped cultivation. And so we don't really classify them as true native flowers. The pale red shows you the actual native distribution of wild tulips, and you can see it extends from Mongolia right across to southern Spain and Portugal. But there are two very significant diversity hotspots, one in Turkey, Iran, and the Caucasus, where there are a large number of species, and a primary diversity hotspot within Central Asia, where the vast majority of wild tulip species grow and are known. And at the eastern end of the distribution, we have this green section, and I'd like to highlight this because this is the Amana group, which is very closely related to wild tulips and has very similar morphology. And they occur across Japan, Korea, and China, and are sometimes known as East Asian tulips. And as I said before, are very closely related to tulips. And we're not quite sure whether distribution stops between Amana and wild tulips and whether there is some overlap in these regions. Now, something that I've worked on a lot is actually the conservation of tulips. But I think a fundamental question to ask before I talk about that is, why should we even consider protecting wild tulips? And there are a number of angles that we can come at this question from. And I think you'll have to sort of make up your own mind on which you think is the most valid or what you think is the most important reason. But I'll present a few to you now. So wild tulips have a really important cultural value across many of the countries in which they grow wild. In Central Asia, they're actually the national flower of a lot of the countries. And if you go into rural communities, they often will know about populations of tulips growing near their villages, and they're a very important part of their heritage. Another reason is horticultural breeding. We've used wild tulips before to breed the original ancestors of the cultivars, but wild tulips now have the possibility of being used again. They have incredible genetic diversity compared to their cultivated cousins, especially with respect to disease resistance and adaptation to climate change. And so some of the traits within wild tulips may be of particular interest in the horticultural world. They play a role within the ecosystems in which they occur. They're very good habitat and resource for insects, and particularly pollinators. And so they have a role to play in supporting other organisms within the habitats they exist in. They're also very useful indicators of the habitat health in general. So we tend to use them to understand whether the habitat is doing well or the ecosystem health is good. If the tulip populations are struggling, we often know that the actual ecosystem itself is struggling as well. So these are really useful indicators. And finally, something that's I think is really important is because they are awesome. I mean, they're incredibly beautiful flowers. They grow in some of the most amazing places in the world. And it would be such a shame to lose this diversity for future generations, not to be able to see these incredible plants in the wild. So hopefully I've given you some idea of why we might protect tulips. But another really important question is which tulips need protecting? And this is sort of the foundation of my work is based on this question of trying to understand how we can think about which tulips we should actually invest in and try and protect in the wild. And so I will now present a short quote that I think highlights the issues with taxonomy and the understanding of species, which can then feed into this question and cause problems. So there is reasonable agreement among taxonomists that a species should represent a distinct evolutionary lineage. But there is none about how a lineage should be defined. Species are often created or dismissed arbitrarily according to the individual taxonomist's adherence to one of at least 30 definitions. Crucially, there is no global oversight of taxonomic decisions. Researchers can split or lump species with no consideration of the consequences. And I think the last few words in this are really important to acknowledge, is the no consideration of the consequences. And the idea of a species is fundamental in many areas of work, and certainly within conservation itself. And so we really do have to consider the taxonomy and the consequences of changing taxonomy with respect to conservation. So to sort of set the scene of the issues with the current taxonomy of tulips, I'll just introduce a little bit about the history of the taxonomy. So the first tulip was actually described by Linnaeus in 1753, but since then over 300 different species have been described. But at any one time, the accepted number of species has only been estimated between 50 to 100, 120 species. And so you can see there's a lot of species here that are not being retained. And this is often because they are either cultivated, they're recognized as cultivated varieties, and so they lose their species status, or that they're naturalized, or that they are deemed to be too similar to another species by a taxonomist and therefore merged within that species. At the moment, we accept about 93 species, and you can see a graph on the right-hand side here that shows the accumulation of these accepted 93 species over time. And I think this graph really highlights some two really interesting points. So A, B, and C, these slightly darker areas, show periods when lots of new tulips are being described. And these actually correspond to periods of time when there was botanists working extensively within Central Asia. And so it nicely highlights the importance of this region and also the incredible diversity of wild tulips occurring there. The second point is this section C, as you can see from the timeline at the bottom, is actually ongoing. So there's a bunch of new species having been described in the last 10 or so years. And this is such a busy group of flowers. There is lots of activity within this, lots of new species being described. And so it's quite a group with flux. And you can see this from this table here, which is just the tulip species described since 2010. And it's quite a long list, plenty from Central Asia, many of them endemics, but we also have species from Iran and the Balkans also being described. And so it really is a group that is expanding all the time. Now, what are we describing these species based on? Well, historically and still very commonly, this is described on morphology, traits of flowers that we can see or measure that make them different from anything else described before them. But in tulips as well, we have the ability of different plants to breed together. Their ability to cross has also been used in the last 50 or so years to sort of build an idea of different groups of these plants and to determine different species. And in the last few decades, the trait of genome size has been used to classify species and used to describe new species as well. Now, commonly in plants, we also have been using genetic data a lot in the last few decades. This is DNA that enables us to understand how different plants are related to one another and is actually a very common tool now within taxonomy. However, within the group tulips, there's been fairly limited work on this, with the last sort of major work having very limited sampling and really not being able to utilize the same amount of data that we can now generate today. And so it was at point 4 that we really felt like there was an opportunity to re-understand the taxonomy by using DNA. And DNA really is an incredible tool. It provides information on the evolution of wild tulips and many other plants, and we can extract it fairly easily from plant material. So on the left here, you can see a plant cell, and DNA occurs in multiple areas of this cell, and we can mash the cells up and extract the DNA using chemicals. In our work, we've very much focused on the DNA that's within the chloroplast, and so we've been sequencing this mainly to look at the relationships. And what we can do with these sequences is we can produce them for many different specimens of many different species. And then we can compare the similarity of these DNA sequences to build an idea of the relationships between specimens. And it very much builds this tree-like structure that Darwin envisioned in his theory of evolution. And that is sort of the output of this type of work. Now, another fundamental part of this is actually sampling a whole range of species, trying to capture as much diversity as possible. And so we've been working extensively with collaborators and very much working in the diversity hotspot of Central Asia to try and capture some of those wildflowers and wild tulips there that haven't been sampled before. So I just want to briefly mention Central Asia to you, or Centralnaya Asia here. It's a region made up, often recognized as these 5 countries of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Now, we work mostly in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan because Turkmenistan is very politically unstable and it is a very difficult region to actually carry out any fieldwork within. Now, Central Asia has what I would describe as an intriguing history. It also has an exciting future. So there's a few pictures here to sort of stimulate the ideas of the region and its culture. So in the top right, we can see Bukhara, which is a Silk Road city, and Central Asia is very much the heart of the old Silk Road. There are lots of these ancient cities still there. And the culture of these cities and the Silk Road is still a very important part of the heritage of this region. At the bottom, you can see a piece of pasture land. Here we see horse grazing. And a very important part of Central Asia is the nomadic lifestyle. And this is very much something that's been ongoing over the past hundreds or thousands of years. And these pasture lands are still very much used today with the movement of animals between different areas into higher altitudes, lower altitudes as well. And so the nomadic lifestyle is still very much a core part of this region. On the left-hand side, you can see a man that I met in Kyrgyzstan, and he shows a number of things here that are really interesting. So he's wearing a traditional Kyrgyz hat, and this is showing his identity as a Kyrgyz man. But also he's wearing a number of Soviet medals. So there's still a very strong influence from the Soviet Union in the region, and still an influence from Russia at the moment in the region. Because many of these countries are actually very young and became independent only in the 1990s. So they're still finding their identity, and they still have these influences from the last few decades. The current situation within Central Asia is quite tricky. There is a lot of political instability in many countries. Poverty in rural areas is relatively high. But I'd say it still has an exciting future. I think development is really ongoing in these areas, and they're really opening up to the world. And so the next generation, represented by the picture in the bottom right, really has so many more new opportunities. And I think one of those elements is the collaboration between partners in the UK and Western Europe with organizations within Central Asia to research biodiversity and other really important topics. And so now I can just move on to show you a little bit about the landscapes of Central Asia, which really are quite some of the most stunning places I've ever been. You can see they have these incredible mountain ranges, the Tian Shan and the Pamirs, that dominate the countries of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And they create these incredible landscapes with deep valleys full of a whole variety of different plants. We have these vast open areas of semi-deserts, a steppe land where plant life is much more sparse, but we get some incredible unique plants in these areas. As I said before, the nomadic lifestyle is still very important, and these pasture lands are still very much used. So we have these areas of heavy grazing where different plants survive. And higher up in the mountains, we have these alpine meadows where once the snow melts, we get this abundance of color coming through as many of these spring flowers emerge from the cold winter. And so there is this incredible amount of diversity within life out there, as well as the ecosystems that you can see here. Now, Central Asia makes up a very important part of the sampling that we've done. We've had field expeditions in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, but we also work across different areas of the distribution as well. So we have colleagues in Turkey and the Balkans collecting material to represent tulips in these regions. And for areas we haven't been able to go to, we've been utilizing collections in botanic gardens to try and cover some of the diversity that we haven't sampled in the wild. And so we've been working very closely with the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh and at Kew, as well as the Naturalis Biodiversity Centre in Leiden and the Gothenburg Botanical Garden in Sweden. And through these different collaborations and partnerships, we've managed to sample around 86% of currently accepted species, which is a real achievement from a lot of people coming together to carry this research. So we're using DNA, and we have this incredible range of samples, and we've carried out the sequencing. And so now I can present you with some of the results. And to do that, I just wanted to show you this taxonomic hierarchy to explain a little about how the results I present sort of fit into this. So the genus itself is Tulipa, and this captures all of wild tulip diversity in the world. Below the genus, we have a number of subgenera, which are categories devised on genome size and morphology. And below the subgenera, there are a number of sections. And then below sections, these are made up of individual species. And so the results I show you will be split on these different levels. So with regards to subgenera, there was originally believed to be 4 subgenera from recent work. Within our work, we've actually found a species that's so genetically unique and very different from any other wild tulip species that is actually deemed to warrant its own subgenus called Eduardo regalia. And so there's actually a 5th subgenus within this wild tulip group. In terms of sections, you can see this is a bit more messy. There's lots of colors that are actually intertwined. So we've been working to try and simplify the picture within sections. So in some cases, we've retained a number of sections that have been described previously. We've added a new section for this incredibly unique plant, which has its own subgenus as well now. And then we've actually decided to merge a number of sections together, because the idea of a section is supposed to be user-friendly, and we believe that by merging these, it makes it much more easily accessible for people working with these plants. Now, the most exciting part, I think, for me and for a lot of our collaborators is the species level. And so I'm just showing you here the tree. It's been split in 2 because it's too large to fit on a single slide. And you don't really need to take anything away from this slide. I just wanted to show you what the data looks like. And actually, it's really the structure of the tree that allows us to make a number of decisions about how specimens are related to one another, and therefore taxonomic decisions based on these. And from these trees, we've been able to make a number of changes to the taxonomy, especially at the species level. And this has sort of occurred through 3 different processes. So in some cases, we've been reinstating species. These are species that have been merged under other species previously because they haven't been thought to be unique enough to warrant species status. But our genetic data actually shows they're very different from what they've been merged under. And so we're now reinstating them at this level. Then we have the opposite process of synonymization, where the genetic data actually shows us that these plants are actually very similar. And so we've managed to merge a number of species together. And In some cases, we've come across things that we sampled that actually don't represent anything previously described. And within our work, we actually discovered a new species called Tulipa toxogulica. And this was originally found to be genetically quite unique, but there are a number of morphological traits as well. So this is the new species, Tulipa toxogulica. It was named after the region in which it's found, Toxogul, and it's known from 4 populations within this region. It is endemic to Kyrgyzstan and only found within a very small area of this country. And as I said before, we originally noticed it was genetically very different from anything else. But if you look at picture E, it also has this incredible elongated tunic, which is the top of the bulb, that reaches up the stem as well, which is quite a rare trait within wild tulips, and actually was something, when we dug it up, we thought, wow, this is, you know, quite a rare thing to have come across. And so we've formally described this now, and this is now a new species. We're also able to do a number of other analyses within our work with this genetic data. We can begin to understand how tulips diversified, and with the trees, we can actually map them across evolutionary time. And this allows us to ask what's diversified where, when, and why, which is quite a powerful tool when we're trying to figure out how tulips have come to diversify and occupy the distribution that they have today. And one of the most important questions that we sort of wanted to tackle was this idea of Central Asia being the origin or the ancestral home of tulips. And this has often been assumed. There's not much data to really support this idea, except for the fact that many wild tulips occur in the region. And so we wanted to set about trying to figure out whether we could use genetic data to support or refute this idea. And we do this by building these trees and looking at how the biogeography of the ancestral tulips maps over time. And the results from this are really intriguing. So actually, it's very clear that the origin of tulips is likely within broader Central Asia. It's very difficult to narrow it to a single country. So it's very much a regional perspective, but tulips likely originated in this part of the world. And what's really interesting is actually that most groups since then within this wild tulip tree actually diversified within Central Asia as well and remain within the region. So Central Asia has not only played a really important part in the origin of tulips, but still plays a really significant role in the diversification of this flower. And it's still very much where most wild tulips are found today. Now, we can also think about how tulips may have got to the distribution that I presented earlier. And our data suggests there were 2 migrations out of this region from Central Asia through a northern route, here shown by the larger arrow, through the steppe land of Kazakhstan and southern Russia, which was expanding at the time and is good habitat for tulips. And also there was a smaller number of species migrating south out of Central Asia to Afghanistan and Iran, but this is a very much more restricted route, and we see very little diversity moving this way. And this is likely because of the deserts and a big, large body of water that used to exist across this region, and also the incredibly large mountain ranges that this diversity would have to cross. And so we really think that the diversity within the secondary diversity center actually originated from tulips that have moved across Kazakhstan and southern Russia. And so it's diversified again within Turkey, Iran, and the Caucasus. And from there, it's actually spread to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and back into Iran as well, giving us this today's distribution. So that's very much the taxonomy side and the evolutionary history of this wild tulip group, and sort of the first half of this talk, if you like. But part of our work is very much focused around protecting wild tulips. And we've built this foundation of taxonomy, but now we must see how that informs the conservation action on the ground. And I think it's nice to have this quote in here to just show you the link between taxonomy and conservation. So taxonomy and species conservation are often assumed to be completely independent activities. However, a shortage of taxonomic information and skills and confusion over where the limits to species should be set both cause problems for conservationists. And so this taxonomic foundation is very much at the center of the conservation work we do. And I think I can highlight this fairly quickly through this brief list of conservation actions. And so the idea of evolutionary history and accepted species really does inform conservation. So for the IUCN Red List, an online database of threatened species, it very much relies on reports written around individual species. Ex situ collections are often built around which species they encompass. And if we're prioritizing within conservation, we often think about which are the most important species. If we're assessing the impact of a threat, not only do we think about how broad the threat is across geographic space, but also how many species it's impacting. And if we're ever writing grants or looking for funding opportunities, we'll often write about which species we're going to work with and which ones we think deemed the most valuable to protect. When we're thinking about identifying sites, we often think about which species occur there. Are there endemic species? Are there particular species of interest? And of course, when we're thinking about use and trade, we often trade within species. So we have to understand which species exist before we can really delve into the information on use and trade. And now we've worked across a number of these different areas. So I'll show you the outputs from some of our work built on this taxonomic foundation. And so the first thing that we've been working on is building ex situ collections. Now, there's a national collection of tulips at Cambridge University Botanic Garden, and this is partly where I've been working, and we've been expanding this collection with new material, including the new species, which is now being grown there. We also work very closely with Gariev Botanical Garden in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, and over the last 4 years, they've established this new collection of wild tulips. And this garden now actually represents, I think it probably represents every species known in Kyrgyzstan within this area of Bishkek now. And these collections have been built based on our new species identities. Climate change has also been considered a serious threat within mountainous regions of the world, but not much has been done within Central Asia or on tulips themselves. And so we've been thinking about the threat of climate change for wild tulips. And we've used our taxonomic basis, and from this, we've developed models of present-day distributions of a number of tulip species here. And from this, we can then project what the distribution will look like under certain climate scenarios, and therefore deem the effect of climate change over time. And I think the simplified version of that is that climate change is a serious threat to every species that we've actually modeled, and so is likely a serious threat to many tulips and plants across Central Asia. In particular, we see huge declines in suitable habitat area shown by the graphs on the left. And this is consistent across pretty much all species. And on the right, you can see graphs that show that actually a number of these species are likely to be forced to migrate to higher altitudes, which is quite a common occurrence for plants under climate change, but it's interesting to see that this sort of plays out within wild tulips as well. And so we have this idea of climate change being a serious threat, and we can now factor this in to conservation action. Now, one thing that is really important is understanding which species are threatened. And within Central Asia, there's been a lot of work done on the national level showing that many tulips are likely threatened. But the IUCN Red List is actually the most comprehensive and most globally used database of threatened species. And here you can see on the left sort of the categories that can be assigned to a species when assessed through this process. And to do this, we collect a lot of different information together for a single species. And using this data, we're able to assign the extinction risk of a species. And in this case, I'm showing you Tulipa kaufmanniana. And here we've assigned it near threatened status. And we actually carried out work like this for 53 wild tulip species in Central Asia, representing around 84% of all tulip diversity in the region. And the major things to pull away from this are actually around 51% of Central Asian tulips are threatened. You can see the split by category here. So the most common category assigned was vulnerable, but there are tulips that are critically endangered and endangered as well. And so these might be of particular interest in the conservation world. Within this process, we also gather a lot of information in different areas, and we're able to look at what's in ex situ collections and what's in protected areas. And in this case, we found that threatened species are often more poorly represented within both of these areas. We can assess use and trade, and although tulips in general in this region are not heavily collected or traded, there are certain species that are particularly vulnerable to this threat, and this is now noted on these databases. And in general, at the bottom, you can see a list of threats, and we can begin to look at which threats are most common and which are of most significance. And in this case, livestock farming or overgrazing and climate change were the two threats affecting the most species. Now, the real pull away is, as I've said before, is 51% of Central Asian tulips are threatened. And in general, we estimate between around 2 in 5 plants are threatened with extinction. And so this is around 40% of a group of plants would be threatened with extinction. And so you can see that wild tulips are actually in a worse state than many other plant groups. And so the conservation of this group is extremely urgent. Now, how do we figure out which species require protection immediately and which ones we may not want to focus on at the moment? Well, the IUCN Red List status is a really useful tool. It tells us, how threatened a species is, and we can prioritize based on this. So in this case, the oceanic white-tipped shark is critically endangered. We may want to focus conservation efforts on it immediately. There are other prioritization methods. So organisms that are ecosystem engineers, they make such big changes to the habitat around them that they have such an important role to play in ecosystems, such as the beaver, or their flagship species, and their protection will enable the protection of a broad area of habitat that itself will encompass and protect other species, such as the snow leopard. We also can think about cost and benefit analyses, or the cultural value of certain species, such as the maple, which is of particular interest in countries such as Canada. And we can also consider the services that organisms provide from existing in ecosystems. We may use that as a prioritization method as well. Something that we thought was particularly interesting within our case, because we had the data to do it, and also it adds a whole new data layer that we can then use in decision making, is actually taking into account the genetic uniqueness or evolutionary uniqueness of a species. And the Zoological Society of London developed a method called EDGE, which is split in two. So it's evolutionarily distinct and globally endangered. And the EDGE method allows you to calculate a score shown by the equation here. And the globally endangered status is just the threatened status from the IUCN Red List. But the evolutionarily distinct value is developed from tree sequence data like the ones we've been using. And it gives you an idea of how genetically distinct it is from any other species occurring in that group. And so the EDGE score itself allows you to incorporate an idea of genetic uniqueness and threat status within a single score. And from this, we can then look at which ones score the highest and prioritize species. And in ZSL's case, they have got species like the purple frog or the beaked echidna as very unique species and warrant urgent protection. In our case, you can see on the right-hand side, this species Tulipa colbint-sevi, which is the highest scoring EDGE score in our analyses. And this is an endemic of Kazakhstan that's critically endangered, but also genetically quite unique. And so this method allows us to identify species that might not be recognized through just the IUCN Red List. And it adds a whole new data layer for making decisions. It's not necessarily better than any of the other methods, but extra information is always very useful when identifying priority species. And so the final area of thinking that that I want to present to you, and sort of is a nice way to end, is the idea of key sites. And we worked on this a little bit within a workshop in 2022 in Bishkek, where we brought together a number of tulip experts from across the region, from these 4 countries. And we asked them to identify key sites based on a number of metrics revolving around which species occur there, which endemics. And so they identified 3 sites in their own country. And you can see them presented here with A, Kazakhstan, B, Kyrgyzstan, C, Tajikistan, and D, Uzbekistan. And this was done as a foundation. And then we asked them to come together and think about how this might play out on a regional level, and how we can identify sites for key species together, and look at how these interlink with borders and protected areas within the region. And so this is the map of the key sites for tulip diversity within Central Asia, as designed by tulip experts from the 4 countries that have been we've been collaborating with. And I think it highlights a few nice things, that there are certain mountain ranges that are of particular interest and certain protected areas of particular interest, but also that collaboration will be a really big part of the future of tulip conservation in Central Asia. And actually, this workshop was supposed to be the start of a process to develop a regional conservation strategy for tulips that will hopefully continue to grow in the next few years as the partners continue to work on this. So I hope throughout this talk, I know I've thrown a lot of information at you and lots of different information, but I hope you can see how the first part of the talk, our taxonomy work, really influences a lot of the work we've done later on with regards to the conservation. And really, it is the fundamental taxonomy that influences nearly all other aspects of our work. And our idea of species has really been a core part of the conservation work that we're now implementing on the ground. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
That was great, Brett. Really interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions for Brett, then, as I said earlier, if you can post them down in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. So we do have one from Cyprian, who says, are there subspecies also?
Yeah, in a few cases, there are the odd subspecies as well. And it's a process to figure out whether we incorporate them into conservation thinking or whether we should focus on the species level. And I think that's very much dependent on how rare they are and how unique they are as well.
Okay. And Susan says, do you rely on photos when recording, studying, or do you use drawings or paintings at all?
So actually, one of the really nice things about working on wild tulips is there is a fantastic monograph that's been was published in 2013 and was actually primarily produced by a botanical artist called Diana Everett. And so there's this incredible book with paintings of tulips of basically every species, and also many of the ones that are now not recognized as species. So this is also a fantastic tool that we've been using a lot. And actually, we've taken books out to Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan to provide this resource for them as well. When we're in the field, we often rely heavily on, either the literature that's already there, but we take a lot of photographs as well. And we collect materials. So we collect herbarium material as well, which is pressed plants that we then bring back and are stored in different herbaria in Central Asia, but also in Cambridge as well.
Okay. Daphne asks, why did you use chloroplast DNA rather than nuclear DNA?
Yeah, it's a great question. Chloroplast DNA is actually a lot more easy to sequence because there are lots of copies of it within individual plant cells. And so it's actually relatively cheap and easy to get that data. It's also quite a large genome, but not too large, like the whole nuclear genome, which is very, very expensive to develop. There are now a number of methods to get lots of nuclear DNA markers, and I think that would be the sort of next step within the taxonomy of wild tulips. That will be the next sort of breakthrough that will sort out some of the problems that are still remaining. But the work we've done has already been a significant step forward on the limited genetic data that there was before.
Okay. I guess also nuclears, when eventually someone sequences that, you'll see how the degree of introgression and such as well, which might be quite interesting. Yeah, a question from Jim. How many European tulip species are there, and how threatened are they?
Yeah, so in terms of European, the ones occurring in Spain and Portugal, that area of the world, there's only a single species. Actually, the most species within Europe are centered around the Balkans, Crete, and Cyprus. I don't know off the top of my head how many species there are. There's probably 10 to 15 in Europe. And there's only been 2 or 3 of them red listed. One of them, I believe, is data deficient, and then 2 of the other ones are threatened. So it gives you an idea of that there are a few threatened species in Europe, but there aren't actually that many species overall in this area of the world.
Yeah. Someone's asked if you published for new divisions in subgenera.
Yeah, not yet. We're working on it. It was written into a thesis, and now we have to convert it to a paper. Yeah.
Okay. Keep your eyes out for that. Lots of questions. Wow. I mean, we can go until 8:30 as long as you're.
Yeah. Please ask away.
Take a few more, Brett.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's been a couple of questions about a British wild tulip, a UK wild tulip, and its origin.
Yeah, so I believe the tulip they'll be talking about is Tulipa sylvestris. And this is one of those ones that's sort of become naturalized across large parts of Europe. And this is the one that does occur native in North Africa and sort of southern Spain and Portugal. And it's very unclear where the native distribution sort of ends, but it's believed to be down there in the Iberian Peninsula. But there are many of these tulips that have escaped collections and have established populations. The climate in the UK is relatively suitable for tulips. Certainly ones like Sylvesters, which are very good at dealing with damp, which some of the species are not. So the origin of it is probably quite tricky to actually pinpoint, because it could have come from a collection or from another country in Europe and moved across. But yeah.
Okay. Question from Colin about conservation. How far is the idea of the regional conservation strategy developed?
Yeah, so when we did the workshop in spring 2022, we had a day to sort of begin to develop the foundation for it. So we looked at key sites. We thought about the activities we might want to carry out in these key sites. And so we sort of began to generate ideas. And then later in the year, we had a number of Kyrgyz colleagues come to Cambridge, and we sat down again and started to think about sort of the Kyrgyz aspects of this work. And so that's developed a bit further, but there's still a lot of work to do in terms of figuring out concrete plans. I think there's a lot of national ideas, and there are people researching in different areas and carrying out action. In Kyrgyzstan, we have fenced plots, we have community conservation initiatives in place, but there's no sort of regional level written report or agreement to carry out collaboration. So I think that'll be something that the project partners will try to build upon in the next few years.
Okay. I think we'll go through maybe 2 or 3 more questions. if that's all right. So we've got one from Teresa asking if there's any commercial interest in your work, as there's been so much with hybridization with wild tulips in the past.
Yeah, I think commercial tulip growing has become quite separate from wild tulips, but there's certainly a growing interest in wild diversity again. And actually, some of our work was funded through the Amsterdam Tulip Museum, which has a particular interest in cultivated tulips, but is also interested in making sure that wild ancestors are protected as well. And so I think there is a growing interest in it, and I'm sure there'll be a number of interested commercial parties in the research and understanding what diversity exists, especially, as I said earlier in the talk, about disease resistance and climate change adaptation. There are certain traits in wild tulips that could be of particular use in the cultivation process.
Okay. Question from Ashley. Do chloroplast, nuclear and mitochondrial sequences give comparable measures of relatedness?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of the use of methods and phylogenetics. So in theory, yes, but in reality, it's not always the case. And so within our work, we have sequenced a small part of the nuclear genome to try and gauge whether they will produce similar relationships. And in wild tulips so far, we think it's fairly consistent across the board. Ideally, you'd be sequencing the whole nuclear genome of all these specimens. That would give you a much better idea of the true relationships. But as I said earlier, that's very expensive and very difficult. So it's just not feasible at the moment. Whereas developing plastomes, chloroplast genomes is very much easier, and we can generate a lot. So we sampled 250 specimens within this work, which is a huge amount of sequence data, which just wouldn't be possible through sort of larger nuclear methods.
Great. Okay, I'll end on a question of my own, I think.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the number of tulip species is expanding, particularly in recent years. Do you think that that's a result of increased interest in tulips and more research generally, or could it be a result of, newer methods being used to describe tulips?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. I think Central Asia has really started to open up in the last decade, 2 decades. And so there's been a lot more expeditions within the region. And so going to areas that people haven't been before and finding tulips that look different from anything that have been there before. And the idea of using genome size and genetic data has also been increasing in the last 20 or so years as well. And lots of the new species have been, partly described on some of these traits as well. So ours is, we've used genetic data. There are lots that have had genome size data linked to them. So there are new methods as well, but often as well, it's historical methods of just identifying species that look slightly different. So there are lots of people who have been going to new areas and just seeing things that are slightly different, and describing new species from that as well. So there's still a lot of value in the morphological data.
Okay, I think we'll end it there. But that was a really enjoyable talk. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was great. And we'll have another talk first Wednesday of next month. So look out for that, everyone. So yeah, thank you very much, Brett.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you all for listening.
Have a good evening, everyone.